Welcome to Standard Theory. So far we have covered the Z0 scale and the beginning of the R scale in horizontal thinking. In this segment we will continue exploring the R scale in orthogonal thinking. Orthogonal thinking refers to an indirect type of communication. Vertical thinking essentially refers to communication between one and the environment. Silent communication refers to one to self. Intimate communication refers to one-on-one. Social communication refers to one to many. Shared communication can be thought of as many to one or an indirect one-on-one communication. The dynamics of shared communication can vary, but the primary aspect determined by the roles of the parties of communication. The parties communicating can be considered to be communicating using either low or high energy or some combination of the two. For this reason, the parties considered are referred to as either aversive or subversive. The terms aversive and subversive refer to the type of identity being used to communicate. The identity of the aversive party is usually already decided or is being considered separately from the self-identity. The identity of the subversive part usually has not been decided or is being considered based on the thoughts or actions of the aversive party. The processes leading to the assumption of either of these roles can vary, and, if not performed voluntarily, can lead to some problems with the dynamic of shared communication. That will not be discussed at this point, though. However, within shared communication, further specification of the handling of the information can be determined. To begin to explain this indirect dynamic, we can begin with a subversive and aversive party. Previously, had I discussed characteristic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7, or 1 through 9. In orthogonal thinking, each person will utilize an indirect activation of one or more of those individual characteristics without necessarily following the lowest to highest activation seen in horizontal thinking. The combination or composition of these individual characteristics will range from characteristics 10 through 17. These characteristics are measured on the R scale within orthogonal thinking in shared communication. We can describe this indirect dynamic by consider the activation of each of these characteristics from each side of the communication cycle. For these examples, we will assume that the aversive party has successfully separated themselves from their own individuality in order to facilitate some type of indirect communication with the subversive party. The subversive party will first consider the thought process or action of the aversive party and, from there, will try to form their own idea about one of the characteristics. In this example, we will assume that the aversive party has interpreted something related to their separation of individuality that relates to the subversive party. The subversive will consider that information and from there, disregard the aversive party in order to draw their own intelligent conclusion about the information from the aversive party. To get even more specific, we can follow the composition of these two processes by relating their specific characteristics to an indirect version of a communication cycle. In this example, we will assume again that the aversive party is communicating something about their social identity. Using that, we can consider a 9 characteristic. Since this is an indirect type of communication, we can use a plus sign in order to denote the idea that a single, specific characteristic is being communicated outside of a normal communication cycle. From there we get 9 and a plus sign. The subversive party can consider that composed 9 characteristic and determine which specific characteristic is influenced the most based on that composition. This theoretically requires some amount of observation or communication with the subversive party, but for this example we can assume that the subversive party associates the 9 composition with a self-interaction or a 2 characteristic or 9 plus 2. This gives a composition of the aversive 9 characteristic with the subversive 2 characteristic, leading to a cycle characteristic of 11. This characteristic is within the constructive range of 10 through 17. With a few more steps, we can decompose this cycle characteristics to its subversive and aversive components. This requires a bit more theory, but for now, when decomposing, we will always assume that the cycle was truly constructive. For that reason, we will decompose our characteristic of 11 using a factor of information related to 1 characteristic. That decomposition would be the cycle characteristic of 11 minus the cycle characteristic of 9, which results in a cycle characteristic of 2. From this, we can assume that whatever information that the aversive party has shared has influenced the subversive party's understanding of their own self-interaction. As mentioned, this can be further specified using the R scale. This experience of this specific cycle characteristic of 11 can be referred to as a shared self-interaction. Similarly, in a constructive sense, a person involved in shared communication can experience other shared versions of intelligence such as shared social orientation, shared intimate identity and so forth. In order to give each of the cycle characteristics a true name, we would have to assume that the cycles leading to those characteristics would always be constructive in a specific way. However, in reality, We might not always be able to do that. For that reason, among others, each characteristic in orthogonal thinking can be referred to based on the cycle characteristic related to the indirect communication cycle. From there, if more clarification is needed, the cycle can be decomposed according to the observations and information known about the cycle. Without that, the assumption might be a valid argument but might be neither accurate nor concise. Orthogonal thinking is a dynamic process but is also indirect. Furthermore, the experience of orthogonal thinking is somewhat favorable over other types of intelligence, especially over horizontal thinking, as the amount of energy required to experience these levels of activation in horizontal thinking is shared between the parties participated in orthogonal thinking rather than the entire amount of information being processed by each individual separately as in horizontal thinking. For this reason, the favorability of the indirect method of communication offered by orthogonal thinking can lead to some disproportionate and destructive outcomes based solely on the need to conserve energy, which makes the intelligent process of shared communication easily confusable with the process of impulse in vertical thinking. That will be discussed sometime later. In this segment we introduce the indirect dynamic of composition, cycle characteristics and decomposition in shared communication in orthogonal thinking on the R scale. These characteristics range from 10 to 17 and contain an aversive and subversive aspect. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue exploring the R scale through absolute thinking and supersocial communication.